Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Shaping Organizational Culture, Best Practices, and Real-World Methodologies. We're so excited to have you here. This is our first webinar of the fall season, so we're excited to kick off today with this topic. My name is Lucy Sullivan. I'm with MRG, and I'm going to be your host for today. And before we get started, just a small bit of technology housekeeping. We are recording today's webinar. So you'll receive a link to the recording, to the slides. We'll do a blog post that have a little summary of the key points and the content we covered and some Q&A as well. And because this is a webinar, everyone is by default in listen only mode and your cameras are off, but we absolutely want to hear from you. So if you have any questions, you'll want to navigate to the bottom of your screen there and enter your questions anytime in that Q&A box. We'll get to them as many of them as we can during the broadcast. And if we don't get to any today, we'll work on following up with you afterwards and do some Q&A on the blog as well. And you don't have to hold those until the Q&A period. You're welcome to enter them in anytime they come to you. And I'll give you just a brief introduction of who we are here at MRG in case you haven't been with us before and who's going to take us through our content today. So MRG is a global leader in designing assessments, and they're designed to impact people in profound and meaningful ways. We have solutions for leadership, motivation, personal development, sales, service, a wide array of things. And the instruments that are research backed, they're insightful, and they're designed to inspire action. And our reports help to foster a deep self-awareness and encourage people to pursue lasting growth. We were founded more than 35 years ago, and our assessments have been used by thousands of certified practitioners in more than 100 countries around the world. So quite a bit of experience, quite a bit of data as well. And our presenter today is David Ringwood. David is based in our Dublin office, and he's been with MRG since 2006. He's our VP of Client Development for Europe, Middle East, and Africa, but he really has an extensive consulting background in all areas, works with clients in different aspects of what MRG does. He teaches certifications, consulting, product development, supporting our practitioners, really in any way that they use the assessments in their practice. And David is very passionate about assessment and how it can be used to support people in their professional lives and just in their lives in general as well. So with that quick introduction, I will hand things over to David.
Thank you indeed, Lucy. It's good to meet all of you virtually, wherever you may be in this good world and on this good day. It's a pleasure to have you, and we're very grateful for your participation. So just to remind you, we are recording this, so you will get a copy of the recording, so don't be concerned about trying to note everything. Do think about what questions you have, because we may be able to get to some in the moment, but we certainly will be able to get to them subsequent to today's webinar. And this is a big topic. And in fact, I'm going to cover the three main aspects of it. Perhaps not to the level that I would love to. Had we had another couple of hours, I would. But there's always opportunities to do deeper dives. So if there's anything you'd like to explore further, please reach out to us and we can go into whatever level of depth or granularity would be relevant to you. So for today, I'm going to be covering three main dynamics around cultural change and cultural practice. The first is clarity around concept. There may be organizations who are not clear, or who have never thought about, or who have had a definition of the type of organization they aspire to be, but maybe that concept is outmoded. Things have changed a great deal, notwithstanding the whole COVID thing. And if this aspect is not clear, then what follows, you can imagine, becomes a matter of chance. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the shaping process around that. Sooner or later, you've got to move from the concept into the practice. The concept at some level is easy to agree to. It's easy to understand. The reality is when you put into practice the concept, it begs a single question. As a leader or as a citizen of this organization, what exactly, specifically, do I do differently tomorrow compared to what I was doing yesterday that helps me to contribute to the shaping of the organizational culture that we say we want if we're going to achieve the types of outcomes that are important to us? Those outcomes typically being strategic and commercial objectives. Research can help to populate that. And as Lucy mentioned, we have over 35 years of research. We have in excess of 1.2 million leaders in our database. So what I'm going to be sharing in part today is empirical. It's not a matter of hypothesis, it's not a matter of opinion, it's a matter of fact. These are living, breathing leaders in real organization. And this is what the research based on empirical findings can tell us about what works in fact when it comes to certain aspects of cultural dynamics. Then of course you got to go keep the promise. What happens must then be sustained. And how do we know what we're doing is having the effect? How do we know that the practices and processes we are employing are actually shaping and sustaining the types of cultural change that we aspire to? We'll talk briefly about that. That's a lot to cover in an hour, and in pursuit of that, I'm going to keep it going. Before I do, I'm going to briefly hand back to Lucy, because one of the things we're interested in is the importance factor around all of this. Now, before anyone asks, the research we're looking at right now is not taking into consideration what is happening during this COVID period. We are gathering research, we've got a good amount of data, we have some good early indicators, and we will be publishing and sharing that research. And that's where it's coming back to. But as it stands in the world we live in at the moment, it is interesting to see the extent to which the whole cultural dynamic is important to you as organizations or to your client organizations where you're in a consulting or coaching capacity. And for that reason, I'm going to hand back briefly to Lucy to facilitate this particular brief poll.
Thanks, David. And we're launching now, and happy to have your input on this. So we're asking just how important it is to your organization or the organizations you work with to define and actively manage the culture of their organization. And we'll give everyone a few minutes to just give us their input there before we take a moment to share. Thanks, everyone. It's always fascinating to see where this falls, since people work with such a variety of organizations. And we'll give everyone just a moment or two more to answer. And share our results. So only 3% said not a big priority, 15% of growing importance, 36%, about a third, becoming a major consideration, and nearly half, 46%, at mission critical.
Wow. Thank you, Lucy. That is fascinating. If my math is correct, that is 82% of you see this either as a major consideration, that this is something of substance, or it's absolutely imperative, the mission critical agenda. It's interesting always to ask the question why. Maybe this is partly a generational thing, that people's experience of the organization is different, that their expectations of the organizational experience is different. It may be that organizations have a greater level of belief that the cultural dynamic is a big success factor if you get it right, or the antithesis, of course, if you get it wrong. So that will be interesting. Thank you, Lucy. I'm going to move on. I'm still seeing the poll on my screen, so I'm going to get rid of that. So let's move from the poll onto the first concept. I emphasize in this section, this is largely around the types of exercises you can do. These are just some examples. I have many others which are more visual, which are slightly more philosophical. But if you assume that the organization is starting at a point where they don't have clarity about what we really need in this organization if we're going to do the things we need to do, or if they have something but it may be outdated, it may be outmoded, it may be something they did some time ago and no one has ever stopped and asked the question except now. There are a series of things that you can do to help people to organize their thinking. This is partly, before I show the first slide, around methodology. And what I mean by that is these exercises are designed to be completed by some of the key stakeholders in the organization, and ideally for them to do it independently of each other. We begin by asking, what is the strategic trajectory? What are the commercial outcomes? What is the business agenda? And most senior stakeholders have a good degree of consensus around that because this is the conversation they've already had. If you ask those same people how they operationalize that in terms of organizational culture, you'll probably get 20 different opinions. That alone is a moment of discovery. So what I'm talking about here is the process of facilitation and some of the methods that can be used in order to elicit these diversity and frankly digression of views. There are many other alternatives. In fact, I've got complete slide decks that you're welcome to beg, borrow, and steal at your discretion from me. So please, again, come back to us. So let's give a few brief examples of this. The thing what we want to get away from is the intellectualization, because it's so easy to do. It gets noisy, it gets complicated. There are a million different models out there, and drive down that road if you will. You'll go to the upper atmosphere. We'll never see you again. I want to take something which is a little bit more feet on the ground, and I want to begin by talking about the realities of the cultural values, not the intellectualization of same. So, where do we start? Well, let's start by what we as an organization are observing. Lucy has mentioned we have many thousands of consultants across over 100 countries and over 35 years of research. We see a lot. We're not a consulting organization per se, but we have eyes and ears in most corners of the world. And what we're seeing in this space is this, that those historical intellectual models, well crafted and well thought through, no disrespect to them, may feel less relevant based on what we're hearing. That something which is more grounded in the actual experience of the organization, so that bottom up as opposed to being imposed downwards, becomes important. They should reflect the underpinning values, mindsets, behaviors, as opposed to something that you try to impose. This is a big one, and I'm going to come back to this point. What's in and what's out? I'm going to suspend that point until I come back to it, because there's something really interesting around that one that's going on. The shift from the collective to the individual, and I say we believe, I certainly believe this is partly a generational thing, because I've done a great deal of research and published around the generational differences. Understanding the uniqueness of the individual is a further reflection of the slightly more bottom-up as opposed to the universal model approach. And specific to that, the focus on different approaches to building communities, building decision-making models, and doing so more collectively, as opposed to the historical, perhaps hierarchical, top-down. The boss says, and therefore it is. That's not the narrative in the mind of younger generations. I'm generalizing a little bit here, but their view of how decisions should be made, can be made, may be different. And the whole diversity thing cuts across a lot of different aspects of diversity, but behavioral diversity is an interesting one, because historically a lot of the models were conformist or highly conventionalized, or invited people to align with a smaller subset of ideal behaviors. Whereas different approaches now, wider approaches, more individual approaches, seems to be part of the currency of the moment. That's interesting. So it's not just about identifying what are some of these dynamics, but also being able to put language on them so that we can articulate, communicate, and put into practice. Very briefly, because I do need to track time, this is an example of one mindset exercise. And typically you would not do just one of these, you would do it a few of them. And I'm going to give you an example just of a few of them that I would do in sequence. The stakeholders would choose perhaps 3 or 4 of these that they would want to sign up, that for them, in their view, as they understand the types of organization they want to create, without discussing with their colleagues, they would select a subset of these that capture the essence of the type of mindset people should walk in the room with, and perhaps 1, maybe 2, that they would seek to avoid. We then collate them and see what degree of consistency. The interesting thing is they just agreed on the strategy. They just agreed on the commercial outcomes. They just agreed on the organizational trajectory. And yet, when it comes to selecting specific characteristics, mindset characteristics in this case, they have different views. That moment of discovery is interesting because this is the conversation they've never had. But this would not be good enough by itself, of course. We move on to other things. Cultural descriptors, not just mindset descriptors. And there's many, many more. This is a subset of ones. And similarly, you choose 2 or 3 of the ones that you think you want to get to. At every single stage of this, you are refining. You are developing the language. You are helping them to clarify their thinking. And in doing so, you're making it much more tangible, much more specific, and you're forcing them to reflect. That is part of why this is iterative. Every single step requires a degree of consideration and reflection. What we want is something that is really thought through. I can give you many other examples of exercises or more visual approaches or quotes from people, and it really does help. I don't have time to do that today as much as I want to. There are 2 things I would want to bear in mind. I think there are some questions that can really help when it comes to qualifying this further. Here are some examples of the ones that I tend to go for. But there's another factor. The derailers. Now, I mentioned earlier, what's in, what's out. This is really showing up as an important consideration, and we can see it more broadly. We can see it in the media, which is not where the top line is, which is the aspiration. Where's the bottom line on this? What's the threshold where organizations are no longer prepared to accept certain types? What are we no longer prepared to tolerate? We see it in the broader media around language around race. Is there things you could say in the 70s and 80s and 90s which you just can't say anymore? And we're seeing something of that organizations are perhaps getting a little bit more of a backbone around where the bottom line is in aspects. What aspects of our cultural practices are we no longer willing to tolerate? Because if you say you want something, but you allow people to engage and practice in a way which is counter to that, you are tacitly endorsing bad behavior. You are looking the other way. You are saying one thing, but allowing the practice to not align with all of that, which is an absolute contradiction and arguably a touch of hypocrisy around all of that. And I'm sure we've all seen it. The organization who say, well, this is what we do, and this is who we are, and this is how we, these are our values. And yet the experience of being in that organization is not quite the same. It's an old story, but there is something around the dynamic in the market now, which is this is becoming one of the measures of the quality of the culture is the bottom line. So let's move to the second section. Think about the questions you may have around all of that. Think about what resources we can provide or areas that you would like to further explore if you would like to. So we talk about moving from concept and we move into practice. And that's where the rubber hits the road, as they say. That's where we start keeping the promises we've just made if an organization has taken time to put some shape on what sort of culture they want. So what can leadership effectiveness look like in different aspects of it? And I think it's important to be specific, but the specificity should be informed by the type of culture they say they want and how that type of culture will act in service of the achievement of those strategic and commercial outcomes. Again, I'm going to give you just a few examples. This is not exhaustive, but I wanted to give you a few flavors of how research, of which we have a substantial body, can be employed effectively to populate the question of what specifically do we do? What practices do we engage in? When we talk about this type of mindset or this type of cultural characteristic, what does that look like when someone walks in the room? And it tends to be then behavioral. So in this area of practice and research, we typically use a tool of ours called the leadership effectiveness analysis, which is a multi-rater, so it can be self, but it also can draw upon the observations of boss, peers, direct reports in whatever proportion feels relevant. So the LEA, or LEA, measures two things in the 360 version of it. It measures 22 specific leadership behaviors. These behaviors are independent of each other. And additionally, it draws upon observations of different competencies. Competencies being ratings of effectiveness. The behaviors, the 22 behaviors, those data are descriptive. They simply describe the behaviors that a leader or an organization is engaging in. But it's not suggesting whether that's good or bad. There is no one right way to lead. Leadership practices that can be effective in one context could be catastrophic somewhere else. The purpose of the LEA fundamentally, when we measure the behaviors, is to accurately and objectively measure the actual practices and behaviors in that organization. That's the descriptive view, and you then have to take an evaluative view based on, are those the practices you would want to see? But the competencies, they're different. That's a 1 to 7 Likert scale. It's completed by observers only. And it's the observers, i.e. boss, peers, and direct reports, ranking the effectiveness of the leader or leaders who are being assessed independently. It's not the person themselves congratulating themselves on how wonderful they are. Now, when you bring both of those types of measures together statistically, the leaders who are scoring high in the competencies, those 1 to 7 scales, what are they doing behaviorally that differentiates them from their less effective counterparts? I'm not going to go into the statistical methodologies as much as we get excited by these things, because chances are you might hang up on the call. What I will say is this, is that when it comes to specific aspects of competency, we can look at all 31 competencies, and I haven't listed them today. There's just a few examples on the screen now. But we can look at particular aspects of leadership and look at what effectiveness looks like in that regard. And this can help organizations to populate their thinking. These are the types of cultural characteristics. These are the types of mindsets that we want to embed in our culture. What types of practices are going to load on that and are going to make us live that promise, in fact? Here's a few examples. So we talked about managing diversity, which is not just of the moment. I suspect this is something that is going to continue to grow and to be important. So leaders who are seen independently by observers only as being more effective in managing diverse constituencies demonstrated certain characteristics. They placed greater emphasis on interpersonal sensitivity, empathy. I know that many of you may be unfamiliar with the labels of the leadership effectiveness analysis, so I will take a moment just to explain. Some are self-evident, such as empathy, others less so. But these were the behaviors that differentiated them. The higher emphasis on empathy. Empathy is not just about being interpersonally sensitive. There's something here about perspective. It's about looking at things from the point of view of the other person and having that more complete observation of the environment. The consensual is the behavior associated with seeking people's views and opinions. It's not just listening, because we can listen passively. We can sit down, fold our arms, and just do nothing and just listen. This is behavioral. This is the leaders who go out and say, I want to hear your voice. Tell me what you think. I would value your point of view. It is active listening. The leaders who are more effective in managing diversity, these are the behaviors that they emphasize more. They equally emphasize greater collaboration. Cooperation is about emphasizing the collective objectives more so than my individual priorities. It's the willingness to defer my own objectives for the sake of the greater good, those around me. The strategic, these leaders are more thought through. Strategic is about cool it down, pause for thought. Let's organize our thinking about this. It's less reactive, it's less short term, it's more objective, it's more evidence-based. But this, the second piece of evidence around perspective. Empathy is around understanding the needs, the feelings, the sensitivities of others. Strategic is a more intellectual view, but it is about being really thought through, really considered in the approach. And it tends to slow things down a bit. It is pausing for thought, putting shape on our thinking. It's very planful. And finally, communication is about setting clear expectations, explaining to people what's required. But it's two-way traffic now, because it's balanced by the consensual. Yes, they're explaining to people what's required, setting clear expectations, and doing so at the outset, which is what communication is about. It's from the get-go. But they're balancing that by also listening, taking on board, making people feel listened to, which is a very important dynamic in leadership. What they're doing less, and again, what differentiates them as being more effective compared to the less effective counterparts when it comes to managing diversity, they tend to emphasize the dominant behavior less. Dominant is about being competitive and assertive and forceful. If you worked for a high dominant leader, you would know it. Less emphasis on self. Now, this is one of the labels that perhaps is less self-explanatory. High self leaders are more autocratic and independent. My decision, my way, my terms. I'm not asking you, I'm telling you. The more effective leaders actually go the other way. The low self leaders tend to emphasize making decisions collectively, not independently. So this identifies the strong democratic theme. Lower on self, higher on consensual. Let's make decisions together as a community, which is consistent to what we've observed as an organization, which I mentioned earlier. And in doing so, let's seek out people's view. Let's give people their voice. That's a particularly democratic, inclusive approach. And finally, this might surprise you a little bit. My first reaction was such feedback was lower. The thing I surmise about this is communication is a behavior that they emphasize more, feedback less. Communication is earlier stage. Feedback is more downstream. after the fact, letting people know what you liked, what you didn't like, where they stand, and so on. It seems to be that the more effective leaders when it comes to managing diversity emphasize more early stage communication, early stage expectations setting, providing a more instructional approach to their leadership. It's very unlikely you'll misunderstand what a high communication leader wants from you. That seems to be one of the points. Now, this is just one aspect of effective leadership practices. And if part of one of the cultural markers that the client or yourself decide you want is diversity, these may be behaviors that you would want to promote or endorse or reinforce in the organization. Similarly, and this is a common one because everyone wants it, a common choice is the entrepreneurial culture. And I'll go to this one more quickly because you understand the concept now. The leaders who are more effective in driving entrepreneurial change and practice, what exactly are they doing that differentiates them from the ones who are seen as being less effective? Well, excitement. Excitement is about visible energy, enthusiasm, passion. They're more overtly energetic. You could see how that will contribute. Delegation. They focus pushing responsibility down. They employ the resources of the organization by tossing work and responsibility and ownership their way. It makes scalability much easier to achieve because if we all just are hands on ourselves as leaders, but not using the people around us to full effect, you could see where that would go. And it creates a strong learning environment, of course, because now people are learning experientially, not just instructionally. The persuasive, the buy-in, they're using language not just to describe and to explain, they're using language and facts and information to convince, to influence. So excitement and persuasive come under the category of developing followers in the Leah model. And what's interesting is that that whole agenda of getting people on board, getting them on the bus, so to speak, appears to be particularly important. Lower emphasis on cooperation. This is not an attitude test, by the way. Low cooperation does not mean uncooperative. It just means people focus more on their own individual responsibilities and deliverables. It's a slightly more individualistic culture, that whole entrepreneurial dynamic. Structuring. Structuring is about paying attention to detail and process driven, and some people love it. That whole systematic, process-oriented, meticulous, highly attentive to detail, there's less emphasis on that. What that implies is that there's greater emphasis on being agile and adaptable, and how we do it perhaps is less important. Let's keep our options open. Let's navigate the journey as it happens. There's stronger themes of agility going on here. There's also less deference to authority. If it was strong on deference to authority, it would be a culture where you do what you're told, you follow the rules, you don't ask questions. This is the opposite. This is a culture where it's okay to challenge the views or potentially to negate the views of more senior leaders. It's okay to push back. And there's an implied permission in all of this to ask some tough questions if you hear something from the boss that you don't think makes sense. That's an interesting aspect. Again, we're moving from the concept to actual practices. This gives leaders a tangible sense of what specifically I should be doing and what I should be looking for and further promoting in the constituencies I'm responsible for. And the final one I'm going to wheel through very quickly, really for the purpose of the recording and around employee engagement. I have a whole separate webinar on employee engagement. We have a recording of it for those who missed it. Lucy can connect you with all of that. And there's many other webinar topics that you may be interested in. So these are the ones that the more effective leaders who drive employee engagement, this is what they're doing. This is what differentiates them from the less effective leaders. And the ones that they play less emphasis on so much. Again, we see the themes of the democratic, we can see the buy-in, we can see the importance of communication and management focus, which is demonstrating a certain level of leadership, of command, taking charge, driving things forward. These are some, but only some, of many competencies. Whatever feels relevant to you or to your clients, we can have a look at. And it's relatively easy to say what empirical research, which again is not a matter of opinion or guesswork. This is what works in fact, and we can slice it. You may want to look, okay, well, we're in financial services, or we're in FMCG, or we're in advanced technology. Talk to us a little bit more about what it looks like in that particular neck of the woods. We can do that too. One of the things we have to be cognizant of is the reality of the world. We've all, I'm sure, seen mission statements or cultural descriptors, which frankly is aspirational nonsense. Wouldn't it be wonderful if? Sure. And a lot of leadership models and cultural models are very broad and invite people to be all things to all people. And it's a little bit of a fallacy. We have done a substantial body of research in this area, looking at two main dynamics. It is a bit of a generalization, but it's really important. Results versus relationship. The leaders who are very effective when it comes to driving results, compared to the leaders who are very effective at driving relationships, using the same methodology and the same tool, using a good old sample size over 17,500 and done very recently. What is the likelihood that leaders are good at driving both at the same time? Because the model typically invites the all-rounder, does it not? So what percentage of leaders rank in the top third of both relationships and results at the same time out of a population of over 17,500? You might want to Irish up your coffee before I answer this one, because the top third only accounted for this percentage. Less than half of 1% were in the top third. The likelihood in a large sample or even a small sample that you're going to find leaders who are as effective in both of these areas at the same time is pretty low. If you start building stuff like this into your cultural model, it does go back to the aspirational, we get that, but the likelihood it's going to happen in fact is relatively low. This research has been independently peer-reviewed and has been published in a book called Social by, I think it's Professor Matt Lieberman at the University of California. The top half, you would hope, would be a little bit more optimistic about, and you would be right, but let's not get too optimistic. Less than 3.5% were in the top half within that research body. So these are factors that you can use to reality test the model. Any plan is only good if it's realistic. And the research can be used not only to populate the types of characteristics that you want, but the types of ratios where you place your bet, the types of priorities that you emphasize, and what's most likely to work in fact. There are reasons for that. I'm not going to talk too much about this. The Evergy president, Tricia Nadav, has done some fabulous and frankly fascinating work around neuroleadership. And her domain of expertise on this is much stronger than mine in any event. But there are particular reasons. It's not arbitrary. There is causality about why the social thinking, the relationship, versus the non-social, which is more about the results, tend not to co-occur in the ratios that we would love them to, but it tends to happen less. We talk about effective leadership. let's look very briefly at what does not work. What does research tell us about the types of leadership practices which slightly more universally can derail a little bit? Now, we've done this across industry, across culture, across management levels, and here's the interesting thing. Irrespective of culture or function or industry or sector or management level, there are some things that just keep showing up as aspects of leadership practices that are universally seen as much less effective. Again, rated independently by observers, boss peers, and direct reports. Very briefly, what are they? There are 4 broad categories. Again, this is a large sample size, slightly less than 16,000. Again, it's very, very current. It's probably no big surprise that the old my way or the highway approach doesn't work. And again, we move from concept to practice. This type of leader focuses high on self. My decision, my way, my terms. I'm not asking you, I'm telling you. Consider yourself informed, I heard recently, which is delightful. The feedback is high, the strong emphasis on the management focus, but also on dominant, which is slightly more the assertive, aggressive, competitive, command and control. I'm sure we've all met one of those in our day. But less on the consensual. So now it's autocratic. High self, my decision, my way, lower on consensual, less time seeking people's input. So it is literally, I'm not asking you, I'm telling you, consider yourself informed. And in a way which demonstrates less interpersonal sensitivity. I'm not going to repeat this for each of the 4. I'm including them really for the purpose of the recording. The second type, just a more compliant type of individual. They emphasize certain behaviors, but it tends not to work. The high deference to authority, do what you're told, follow the rules, don't ask questions. Just a blind loyalty, the unquestioning approach. These are the practices that they do more and less. Sticking to the rules, similarly, there are practices here which, I'm going to go back, there's only 2 in this one. They just do what they're told and they operate in a highly proceduralized, very consistent way. And then there's the slightly more light than heat type of approach. So there is something here about understanding where the priorities are. The types of behaviors, once we're clear what type of culture we want to create, or we're at this point in our journey, where do we want to take it? What types of practices specifically are going to help and to be in service of that type of change? What sort of practices are less likely to drive us down that road, or may in fact hold us in a certain place? I'm going to pause for a moment. Lucy, any comments or questions we need to get to?
Yes, we have a lot of great ones. I think a lot of them we'll end up doing outside of this, but one question around the research. Well, we touched a lot on LEA research, and sort of an intriguing question was posed from someone who's familiar with the IDI, our motivational tool, is how do IDI practices fit into this culture work?
Yeah. I'm going to tell you a joke. Now, the bar for humor is pretty low at MRG, so brace yourself. It's the old psychologist light bulb joke. How many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is only 1. But the bulb must want to change. And that is the crux of the issue in many cases, is it's okay to talk about changing practices, but there is some, for any of us individually, before we think about the collective, there's a tipping point after which we are trying to be someone we're not. There's a tipping point after which we're doing things which we're intellectually capable of doing it all day, but there's nothing in it for us. So not only does it lack authenticity, it lacks sustainability. And one of the things I like to do, and I think it is probably more a downstream process, is to see where people are motivationally. What does the organization have appetite for? Who are the leaders who at this slightly more fundamentally motivational level, the DNA level, are more aligned with and who may find it easier to identify with, sustain, fully embrace the types of cultural practices? How can we build that into our selection processes so that we know we're hiring people who are motivated to do the things that we want? How do we build it into our high potential practices so that we are identifying people who have a natural, authentic appetite to align with where we need to go as an organization? I think there's something remarkably powerful about that.
Great. In the interest of time, David, because I know you have more to get through in the practical application reality section, which is great. So I'm going to let you keep moving. But folks, continue to have those questions come in. And if we can't get to them during the broadcast, we will follow up with you afterwards.
Indeed. So the reality, so we're moving very briefly from the concept. Let's clear where we need to go. Some of the practices, what exactly would that look like? If we were to put a video camera on someone, how would they be showing up if they were operating in a way that is aligned with the things that we say we want to do? The question then is, okay, so we're clear about all of this. How do we know it's happening? We guessing? We making it up? We hoping for the best? Are we doing the engagement survey 12 months later just to find out? Because that's an expensive way of finding out. So what can we do to test the reality? Before we do that, I think we have a very quick poll. Lucy, I'll allow you to take care of this one.
Yes, and we're going if everyone wants to click in with their answers. So we're curious about what's happening in practice. How much is your organization or organizations you're working with actively doing right now to influence or manage the organizational culture? And go ahead, just give us your first response is the best response, we'll say. So give us your quick thoughts on that. I'll give it just a moment because I know we want to keep getting into this great closing content. So thanks for those who have clicked in so far. And we are going to close it up and show those results. So interesting, we have about 32% that have not defined what they want yet, 17% a plan in place, but not yet active, 28% plans are being implemented, and just 24% they have done culture work and are regularly evaluating and reevaluating.
Yeah. So, well, that's exceptionally interesting. There may be a part of this which is driven by the whole environment in which we all find ourselves, which is the rules of the game are no longer clear. The whole COVID thing has shifted the types of practices which reflect the scramble to deal with the short-term scenario and the need to keep the lights on versus, okay, so when is all this going to be over? What, how do we normalize something that we don't know what it is? How do we normalize things which at the moment feels very intangible and very unpredictable? I don't have an answer to that. I wish I did, because if I did, I'd be probably retiring in a couple of weeks. But there is something around the here and now which may be reflected in this. But the thing I would tend to emphasize is that it does tend to be a work in progress, no matter what. It's like leadership, or it's like parenthood, frankly. The day you think you've arrived is the day you've probably made your biggest mistake. So there are things very briefly that can be done to do the ongoing reality test. Once you've made the choice about the type of organizational culture you want, then I think putting some shape on the types of design practices, and that has to be it. That captures the essence of what we need in this organization if we're going to do the things we say we want to do or that are drop dead important. Equally, what are we no longer prepared to tolerate? It is an increasingly important part of the narrative. And the media alone will tell you what's going on in that regard. Not just what's in, what's out, but also the things which may actually go the other way. And one of the things I would emphasize about this before I move on to the second is when people talk about cultural change, there's often a mistaken dynamic around we need more of this, we need greater emphasis over here, we need to focus more on that. There's less dialogue around there's stuff we've got to stop doing. We have to rein in because it will hold us back. A lot of the models promote the greater versus the practices we need to relinquish, we need to let go, we need to surrender if we're ever going to get to where we need to get to. And it's really important in this definition phase that that is at least borne in mind. 8 times out of 10, you're still going to load on, we need more of this or great emphasis here. But once in a while, you will find it really important that there are types of practices the organization needs to let go. And if that is not included in the conversation, you're going to miss something. The deference to authority is a common one I experience. We've got to stop this yes person mentality. We've got to stop the dynamics where the boss walks in the room and everyone shuts up because nobody feels comfortable negating the view of the chief executive. I know many a chief executive who says, I wish people would negate me. The actual practices, there is a very quick and easy methodology. It's called the culture audit. It uses the LEA model, which is the 22 behaviors. And it's not one where you're generating a whole bunch of reports and you've got to do feedback with people because that's labor intensive, it's remarkably expensive. It's a very quick and easy statistical snapshot. So you can see exactly the actual practices that are going on in the organization at any moment in time. And here's the reality test. Now, the senior stakeholders in the organization, whoever they may be, will have clear line of sight about what is happening, in fact, in different areas of the organization. Not whatever version of the truth the layer below will tell them. They will be able to break it down by function. They will be able to look at it from a gender point of view, or a generational point of view, or a tenure point of view. Whatever way, it's data. You can slice it. You can interrogate it. You will find out what is actually happening in your organization in whatever way you want to define that, more broadly or very, very specifically. I've done a great deal of work in this type of area, and it populates a lot of the thinking. It will show you the delta between where you are as an organization versus where you want to be. Where you want to be is defined by the cultural aspiration. This is where we need to be, yes, but look at what's happening in fact. Now the organization will know to a certainty where to focus the change, where to use their resources most effectively, rather than guessing. They will know what specific aspects of change are really working, which ones have started to get bogged down a little bit, and where specifically in the organization the bottlenecks are occurring, so that they can act upon that. It creates that transparency, that clear line of sight, so that they can really build out and make happen. The culture audit is a tremendously pragmatic tool in that regard. So the practical implications are really, really important. Many, many years ago, I was with Mercer HR Consulting, and this was certainly a substantial part of the work that we did, which was building out process. Again, it's kind of like moving from concept to practice and to absolute reality, you know, because the aspiration is wonderful. You know, I've been planning to go to the gymnasium for the last 20 years, comfortable in the fact I'm never really going to do it. You can't get away with that in stuff like this. So if it's going to work, in fact, you have to put the supporting conditions in place to make sure that you reinforce it. And there's also important cultural statement in some of these reinforcing factors. So the engagement, the experience surveys can really make a difference, because the organization can know and see that you're checking in. It means it matters enough, particularly if it's meaningful and you're not just going through the motions. The reward structure. This is often a good place to live out that promise. If people are embracing and endorsing and being the role model for the types of behaviors that we really want to see in this organization, because if you're going to lead, you have to do first by example. They should be incentivized to do so. They should be rewarded to do so. And equally, and this is the threshold, If they don't, or if they want to do their own thing, which is potentially countercultural, are you going to call it? And not only are you going to call it, are you going to punish them for it at some level? Are they going to lose out? Is there going to be at some level a sanction, either in the reward aspect or in the performance management ratings? You're not living up to the promise. You know, in that forced distribution, you're going to get a lower rating, and that's going to affect your pay. It's going to affect the career trajectory. All of these types of dynamics really take that final step and take the journey we've done today, which is from the concept and some of the specific tangible practices into the types of supporting conditions that embed, reinforce, and therefore effectively sustain the cultural change journey. This is a deep subject. I wish I could have done it slightly more justice, but I needed to respect the time within which we are working today. We're very much up to the hour. So on that note, I'm going to hand it back to Lucy for any questions and for the final wrap up. Lucy.
Thanks, David. A lot of great questions came in. And again, you're welcome to submit those through the end of the broadcast. We can follow up with you afterwards. One that I think would be great to get to now, you talked a lot about how behavioral diversity is being embraced more in modern culture models. How does behavioral diversity affect or contribute to a cohesive cultural identity?
There's a few answers to that. I'm going to give you the briefest version of it. I think when it comes to, well, I'm going to talk not just about behavior. I think when it comes to things like values, I think a reasonable degree of consistency can be helpful. That people who want to conform to a certain standard or principles or values that they hold true. I think when it comes to behavioral diversity, that's where diversity is much easier to embrace, particularly now, because I think people want it. And what it implies, to your question, is it implies a culture where people can be who they are. People can find an authentic way to engage and to lead and to manage without having to conform to a very narrow definition of same. For example, very briefly, there may be those who prefer the slightly more traditional top-down hierarchical view of leadership, and they prefer to lead through authority. They assume command and they have power available to them and they take it up. There may be those, and particularly in newer generations, who prefer the more facilitative approach to leadership. The pull effect, come with you, come with me. I will encourage you, I will empower you, I will nurture you. But the deauthorizing, I'm not the boss, I'm one of you guys, type of philosophy leans slightly more in that direction. And it's creating a culture where there is not one right or wrong way to approach things. For the leader, your responsibility is to look around the room and assess what works for your team at a team level, at an individual level, which again goes to the bottom-up experiential thing, and make your choices and let the organization support that, as opposed to the organization impose upon everyone a single model which everyone has to conform to.
Thanks, David. So quickly, for those who are still here for the last minute, and again, feel free to keep typing those questions and we'll get back to you. We will send you the slides in the recording. We'll have a link to a blog post that has our webinar wrap up and some of the Q&A. I listed a couple of the research resources that I'll be sending out that we referred to, some other studies that David talked about. We'll add a few more based on, I took some notes while David was talking, so we'll have quite a few links for you to get more in depth on some of the research that we spoke about. And of course, we have many more events coming up. As I said, we're really kicking off the fall season right now. So plenty of certifications, of course, in the LEA if you're not already certified, particularly in the culture tool. That starts on October 6th. We have webinars. We have something new called a tool talk where you really get to know one of our assessments. So please visit mrg.com and the calendar for all your registration needs for those. And with that, I will close us out. Email us, get in touch anytime. Thank you so much for giving us the hour, and we look forward to continuing the discussion with all of you. Thanks everyone so much. Have a great day.